say and spell your first and last name?
Yes, Detective T.J. Powell, P-O-W-E-L-L, assigned to the Cleveland Police Homicide Unit. I was the lead detective investigator on this case, and I can honestly say, Your Honor, in my 17-year career as a Cleveland police officer, this by far is the most horrific case I've ever had to investigate, Now, I've been a detective for 10 years.
A mother's love is meant to be the most powerful bond in the world, unwavering, protective, and unbreakable. But what happens when that bond is shattered by neglect? This is the heartbreaking story of JAILYN, a 16-month-old girl whose brief life came to a tragic end, leaving a community stunned and seeking justice. JAILYN's life was cut short in the most unimaginable way, alone, vulnerable, and abandoned. Her mother, Crystal Candelario, made the decision to leave her home for 10 days, embarking on a vacation while her daughter was left behind. No family, no babysitter, no help. What unfolded next is a story of sheer heartbreak, a child who slowly succumbed to starvation and dehydration in the very place she should have been safest. Wherever you're watching from, we'd love your support. Be sure to like and subscribe to stay informed as we explore stories like this one. Crystal Candelario was no stranger to life's challenges. A single mother living in Cleveland, Ohio, she navigated the ups and downs of parenthood largely on her own. Those who knew her described her as someone who seemed to carry a heavy weight, a woman who juggled the demands of raising a child while trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy in her life. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Crystal's choices, influenced by mounting pressures, would eventually lead to a devastating series of events that no one could have predicted. At the center of this story is JAILYN, Crystal's 16-month-old daughter. Neighbors who occasionally saw her outside described her as sweet and full of wonder, the kind of child who could make even the most hardened heart melt with her smile. But JAILYN's world was small, confined mostly to the walls of her home. She depended entirely on her mother for safety, love, and care, a dependence that would tragically go unmet. The 6th of June 2023. The events leading to JAILYN's untimely death began on June 6, 2023. On that day, Crystal made a decision that would alter the course of her life and shatter the lives of those around her. She packed her bags and left her Cleveland home, embarking on a trip that would take her first to Detroit and then to Puerto Rico. For most, a vacation is a chance to recharge, to escape the pressures of daily life. But for Crystal, it came at an unthinkable cost. JAILYN was left behind, alone, without food, water, or care, for 10 long days. The silence that enveloped the home during Crystal's absence was unsettling to the neighbors. JAILYN, usually heard babbling or crying, seemed to have disappeared. The curtains remained drawn, and no one entered or exited the house. At first, they thought little of it. Perhaps Crystal and JAILYN were visiting family or staying elsewhere temporarily. But as the days dragged on, the unusual quietness began to gnaw at them. Something wasn't right. While Crystal enjoyed her travels, posting photos and updates on social media, the reality inside her Cleveland home was starkly different. JAILYN, confined to her crib, was left to endure the slow, agonizing effects of starvation and dehydration. The details of those 10 days are too harrowing to imagine. A toddler, unable to understand why no one was coming to her rescue, fading away in the very place she should have been safest. June 16, 2023. June 16, 2023, marked Crystal's return to Cleveland. What she discovered upon walking into her home is a scene that defies comprehension. JAILYN was unresponsive in her crib, her small body showing the unmistakable signs of neglect and suffering. In that moment, any facade of normalcy crumbled. What had been a mother's failure to prioritize her child's needs became a horrifying tragedy that would soon capture national attention.
Please wait that you come on and you please fire EMS. Even police need police fire EMS. What's that? One, two, nine, 3129 West. Hello? Please, I need help. Okay, I can't help you if I don't know where you're at, so tell me the address so we can help you. Please, 3129 West 97. Okay, is there a single subword apartment? Please. What's your name? Crystal. Crystal. What's your last name, Crystal? Please don't tell me how please tell me. What's your number in case you get the what's your last name? Disconnected. Tell me what's going on. What's going on? I'll give you a few moments to calm down. Crystal. Please listen to me so I can help you. She don't respond. She's white. You got it. I understand you. Tell me who's white. Please. Your mom? Is that your mom? I'm a mom, yes. I'm a mom. You live here? I'm going to get you over in my... Oh, my goodness. That's what it's okay?
On June 16, 2023, Crystal Candelario dialed 911. Her voice, calm but strained, conveyed a chilling detachment as she claimed her 16-month-old daughter had been unwell for days. What the emergency responders would find upon arriving at her Cleveland home was far more harrowing than anything her words could describe. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, with an overwhelming sense of abandonment. In the corner of the room stood a playpen, meant to be a place of safety and comfort for a toddler. Instead, it became the site of a tragedy. JAILYN was found in the playpen, her small, emaciated body surrounded by waste. The conditions were appalling: filthy blankets, soiled diapers, and the unmistakable smell of decay. It was clear that JAILYN had been left alone for far too long, her tiny body showing the unmistakable signs of starvation and dehydration. The responding Cleveland police officers were visibly shaken. These were individuals accustomed to difficult scenes, but nothing could prepare them for the sight of a child who had suffered so greatly. The lead investigator later described the scene as unimaginable, a word that barely captured the extent of the neglect they encountered. JAILYN, a child, had been reduced to a heartbreaking symbol of indifference and abandonment. Ring camera footage from a nearby home provided further evidence of Crystal's actions. The footage showed Crystal leaving her house 2 days before she officially began her trip to Detroit and Puerto Rico. Carrying suitcases, she walked briskly to her car, locking the door behind her without a second glance. The knowledge that JAILYN was still inside that house, left entirely alone, made the footage all the more haunting. When questioned, neighbors expressed regret for not acting sooner. They admitted they'd noticed the unusual silence from Crystal's home during her absence but assumed she had taken JAILYN with her. Some reported a sense of guilt, wondering if they should have intervened when they'd heard the cries. Their testimonies, while heartbreaking, painted a picture of a child whose cries for help went unanswered by those closest to her. The evidence gathered at the scene and from the neighbors left little room for doubt. JAILYN's death was not an accident. It was the result of deliberate neglect, a failure to provide the most basic care for a child who relied on her mother for everything.
And neighbors told me this is not the first time Candelero has left the baby home alone.
We keep telling her not to leave her by herself. Not only me, my friend across the street too, but she always be here by herself.
They got to know and love little JAILYN. They say they took JAILYN in many times when Candelario went to work, even describing her as one of their own. According to these neighbors, Candelario left JAILYN often.
It wasn't really her mom that was taking care of her, it was her grandma that was mostly taking care of her. Her mom always wanted to go out and just left her with her grandma and all that.
She was refusing to do the food and she was with no appetite. I said, oh my God.
This is after last Monday and Tuesday when she was throwing up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Are you talking about Monday and Tuesday like 4 days ago?
Yeah, the
Okay.
last week, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Because we almost done this week, so I talk about,
Because what, this week?
This week. Yeah, I talk about because we almost done, the
Oh, we're almost done with this week.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so that was just Monday and Tuesday of this week. She was throwing up.
Yes.
And then how was she Wednesday and Thursday?
She was with no food, just with a meal because she was refusing. Maybe it's because she get vomiting 2 days, before.
Yeah.
So that's why I was scary because I say, oh my God, I need to go to the hospital because she doesn't eat anything and she was lose tiny, her weight. I lose, her weight. But right now in this morning when I wake up, she was asleep. She sleep every day 12 hours.
Okay.
She sleep like at 8 p.m. through 9 or 10 a.m.
Okay.
12 hours. So in this morning I was sleeping too. I never wake up. She was
What happened? What was going on last night?
last night she was crying a lot. And I see one moment when I was take a shower, and she was screaming like, I don't know, probably she get a pain.
Okay.
Maybe.
About what time was that last night?
Maybe at 7 or 8 p.m.
Okay.
So she was screaming like, probably for pain or something like that. In this morning when I wake up, I took her in the morning for, JAILYN, wake up, and she wake up, and when I see her, I see she looks like a really, really dry, like ¿cómo se dice cuando una persona se chupa? O sea, kind of like,
Oh, like her face was sunken in?
So, y ahí fue que yo me asusté y dije,
The bond between a mother and a child is one of the most purest and most sacred bonds between human beings.
Prosecutors wasted no time laying out their case. They began with the most damning evidence, ring camera footage showing Crystal leaving her home, suitcases in hand, 2 full days before her official trip began. The time-stamped footage revealed her walking to her car, locking the door behind her, and driving off, knowing full well that JAILYN had been left alone inside. The prosecution argued this was not a momentary lapse in judgment but a deliberate act of abandonment. They reinforced their case with travel photos Crystal had shared on social media. Images of her smiling in Detroit and sunbathing in Puerto Rico stood in stark contrast to the grim reality of her daughter's suffering back home. These photos were used to highlight what prosecutors described as Crystal's callous disregard for her child's well-being. Medical evidence provided further weight to the prosecution's argument. Expert witnesses testified about the signs of starvation and dehydration found during JAILYN's autopsy, describing in detail how these conditions develop over time. This was not an accident or a sudden event, they explained. It was the result of prolonged neglect, during which JAILYN's body slowly shut down. Neighbors and first responders took the stand. Their testimonies painted a vivid and heartbreaking picture of the aftermath. One neighbor tearfully recounted hearing JAILYN's cries in the days before her death, her voice growing weaker until it stopped entirely. A police officer described the scene inside the house as one of the worst they had ever encountered, choking back emotion as they detailed the conditions in which JAILYN was found. The defense, however, sought to shift the narrative. Crystal's attorney argued that her actions were not born out of malice but a culmination of untreated mental health struggles. They painted her as a woman battling severe depression and anxiety, overwhelmed by the pressures of single motherhood and lacking the support system she so desperately needed. Family members were called to the stand to corroborate this narrative. Crystal's sister testified about a history of mental health challenges, revealing that Crystal had been hospitalized multiple times in the past but had never received consistent treatment. Her struggles, they argued, were compounded by financial stress and isolation, leaving her in a state of despair that clouded her judgment. The defense leaned heavily on expert testimony, bringing in a psychologist who had evaluated Crystal after her arrest. The psychologist described her as exhibiting symptoms of severe depression, including withdrawal, impaired decision-making, and a diminished ability to assess consequences. They argued that these factors played a significant role in her poor choices, though they stopped short of claiming she was entirely incapable of understanding the gravity of her actions. Despite these arguments, the prosecution remained steadfast. They countered the defense's claims by pointing out the premeditated nature of Crystal's actions. Prosecutors emphasized that she had ample time to arrange for childcare or reach out for help but chose not to. Her decision to lock the door, leave for 10 days, and post pictures of her vacation suggested a level of awareness and intent that could not be ignored. The emotional weight of the trial took its toll on everyone involved, from the jury to the spectators in the courtroom. The question of whether Crystal's actions were driven by neglect, mental health struggles, or outright indifference became the crux of the trial, leaving the jury with the unenviable task of determining her fate. One neighbor, a middle-aged woman who lived directly across the street, described Crystal as carefree. She testified that it wasn't unusual to see Crystal leave the house without JAILYN, sometimes for hours at a time. "I always thought she had someone looking after the baby," the neighbor admitted, her voice shaking. "But there were times I'd hear JAILYN crying non-stop. It just didn't feel right." Another neighbor recalled seeing Crystal come and go with little regard for what seemed like normal parental responsibilities, painting a picture of a mother detached from the needs of her child. The prosecution used these testimonies to emphasize that Crystal's decision to leave JAILYN alone for 10 days wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment but part of a troubling pattern of neglect. The neighbors' accounts were backed by video evidence, including ring camera footage showing Crystal departing her home, casually locking the door behind her. It was a stark contrast to the reality of the situation inside, the defenseless child left to fend for herself. When the medical examiner took the stand, the atmosphere grew even heavier. The examiner began by explaining JAILYN's condition at the time of her discovery. Using clinical but impactful language, they described how the 16-month-old had endured a slow and agonizing decline due to starvation and dehydration. Her body showed clear signs of prolonged suffering, the examiner stated. He detailed how her organs had started shutting down over several days, a process that could have been easily prevented with basic care. The most haunting part of the testimony came when the examiner described JAILYN's physical state. She was found in a filthy playpen, her tiny body emaciated, surrounded by waste. The lack of food and water, coupled with the unhygienic conditions, had caused severe deterioration. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the examiner shared these details, and even seasoned officers in attendance appeared visibly shaken. The examiner concluded their testimony by saying, "This was not a sudden event. This was prolonged neglect, resulting in a death that no child should ever experience."
These are very serious mental health drugs, and you need to be tapered off of these medications, or there could be some side effects. Not only the side effects, but the actual underlying conditions that she may have had or been suffering from are also going unmedicated at this time. And then we get into her trip, and I'm not going through that again. That's the worst thing I've ever heard. And I commend the prosecution and the detectives for their work. It was unimaginable, terrible, and I feel for all you guys having to do with that too, and her family as well. It's when the prosecution showed pictures of her on her trip. Pictures can be deceiving. Personally, for having myself suffer from depression and anxiety, you can't tell what a person's going through from a picture, what they're dealing with on the inside. And I'm thankful for the support that I had from my family, my friends, my doctors. She didn't have any of that. She was hiding it from herself, from her parents. Nobody knew what she was suffering from. Her doctors even thought it was migraines and possible strokes. And to be honest with you, when I first met her, Your Honor, after this happened in June, I met a person that was devoid of emotion. Just after hearing what had happened on the news, and then I get the call, she wants to meet with me, and I go talk to her, it was not what I expected. She had no emotion. She couldn't explain anything. I had no idea who I was talking to. But I'll tell you right now, this is not the same person. This person now is compliant on her medications. She's been taking them through the prison throughout the whole time that she's been in here. Again, there's no justification for her action when she was out there, what she was doing. She could have called somebody, she could have done that, yes, but when you're in that state, when you're off medication, mismanaging your thoughts, you're not thinking clearly, her body she had to get out, and she was having fun. If she was okay, in her mind, JAILYN was okay. But of course, that's not the case. But I will point to when she did finally get home, and we heard that 911 call, she didn't want this to happen. You could hear that. Screaming, "Help me, my daughter's dying." Yes, because of your actions, because of what your choices were. And you took responsibility for that. But that call, that one tiny breach from whatever was going on in her head, that reality that her daughter was dying, she was calling for help. She didn't want that.
Lastly, Your Honor, you're going to hear that Ms. Candelaria was depressed. And no one more than I appreciate mental health and mental health issues and the programs that this court and my office have tried to implement to help folks with mental health. This is not the case here. This is not the case at all. Her actions speak louder than words. She had the wherewithal to leave Cuyahoga County and drive to Detroit, to be not with one man, but with two, let alone leaving a child, her own flesh and blood, in a pack and play. And during the time that she has been locked up, she has been making plans for the future, talking to other folks at other jails, other prisons. She had a conversation, which I find more disturbing than not, but on November 26, 2023, instead of wrought with emotion, wrought with guilt, crying about the death of her child, she's talking with a friend about her trip to Puerto Rico and what a blast it was and how much the car cost. And they got a truck versus a car even though it was more expensive. And they were concerned about the other woman that was on the trip because she liked to spend money. And they spent money on food. There was never mention about her daughter in her phone calls. And in fact, on January 6th of 2024, she's talking to her mother, who she repeatedly talks to, and they talk about God is forgiving, God is this. You also have to take responsibility for your actions.
As the trial progressed, the emotional toll became evident. The jury, faced with such harrowing details, struggled to maintain composure. Spectators in the courtroom wiped tears from their eyes, and the tension rises as the case neared its conclusion. The verdict was delivered in a packed courtroom. The judge addressed Crystal directly, their voice stern and unyielding. "Your actions," the judge began, "constitute the ultimate betrayal of a parent's duty to protect and nurture their child. JAILYN was defenseless, entirely dependent on you for her survival. And yet, you chose to abandon her in the most callous way imaginable." Law enforcement officials, including Cleveland Police SGT Teresa Gomez, fought back tears as they described the baby's condition. "This is a case that will have branded in our minds and in our hearts forever," Gomez said at the sentencing. "The bond between a mother and a child is one of the most purest and most sacred bonds. It's a relationship built on love, trust, and unwavering protection. You committed the ultimate act of betrayal," Sheehan said. "That little baby persevered, waiting for someone to save her. And you could have done that with a simple phone call. Instead, I see photos of you on a beach while your child was eating her own feces in an attempt to survive. Just as you didn't let JAILYN out of her confinement until she died, so too you should spend the rest of your life in a cell without freedom," Sheehan said. "The only difference is that prison will at least feed you."
You can have an accurate spelling.
Teresa Gomez, Teresa Gomez. Good morning, Your Honor. Your Honor, thank you for allowing me to be the voice for JAILYN Candelario, a beautiful angel whose life was cut short for no good reason. This tragedy should have never happened. I am Sergeant Gomez from the Homicide Unit. The entire Homicide Unit, Cleveland Homicide Initiative, and our partners from the FBI are here today in honor of baby JAILYN Candelario. When we were first notified of this horrific case, we were all heartbroken. But when we started digging deeper into the investigation, it was beyond horrific. It was revealed that the defendant, Crystal Candelario, left her own child alone for hours, which led to days, which led to weeks. This 16-month-old baby was left alone in a pack and play to fend for herself for 11 days with no food, maybe milk, the clothing she had on, and the diaper she was wearing. This baby loved her mother, she needed her mother, and her mother betrayed her. Mothers usually want their children to have a long, happy life, but Candelario placed more importance on a vacation in Puerto Rico with her boyfriend than the health, safety, and well-being of her own daughter. She chose to satisfy her own needs and desires over that of her own child.
Crystal's court-appointed attorney was in the unenviable position of trying to defend the indefensible.
The thought of this child dying every day while she's having fun, humanity can't stomach that. And those are the actions that need to be punished. She abandoned her daughter and left her for dead.
The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing, lead detective T.J. Powell said JAILYN will never be forgotten. His voice quivered as he read a poem he wrote in her memory.
We're JAILYN's voice. Unfortunately, there's no family on our side, but we're her family. I wrote a short poem, just something in commemoration of JAILYN's life. J is for the justice that'll be received today. A is for the angel wings she earned on that joyful day. I is for the incremental repetition, build up of suspense for an innocent bystander's death that clearly makes no sense. L is for the lack of love while alone for 11 days. Y is for a young life that was taken away. N is for new eternal life JAILYN gained on that day. No child should ever have to die this way. JAILYN's life truly mattered. Unfortunately, she died trying to survive off of her own urine and fecal matter.
Your Honor, good morning. Sorry. Hay mucho dolor que tengo con respecto a la pérdida de mi bebé JAILYN.
There's so much pain that I have in regards to the loss of my baby, JAILYN.
Estoy muy dolida por todo lo que pasó.
I'm extremely hurt about everything that happened.
No estoy tratando de justificar mis actos,
I am not trying to justify my actions,
pero nadie sabe cuánto yo estaba sufriendo
but nobody knew how much I was suffering
y por lo que estaba pasando.
and what I was going through.
Todos los días le pido perdón a Dios y a mi hija, JAILYN.
Every day I ask forgiveness from God and from my daughter, JAILYN.
Soy una persona creyente de Dios
I'm a person who believes in God.
y reconozco hoy que todos y todas, muchas ocasiones, somos tentados por el enemigo.
The courtroom was silent as the judge pronounced the sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The words hung heavily in the air, a definitive conclusion to a case that had left a community reeling. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to capture the reactions of those who had followed the trial closely. Community members expressed a mix of relief and frustration, relief that justice had been served, but frustration at the absence of remorse from Crystal. She'll never have to face what JAILYN went through, one attendee said bitterly. That's the real injustice. The Cleveland community was shaken to its core when the details of JAILYN's story emerged. Her short, tragic life and the circumstances of her death ignited an outpouring of grief and reflection. In the days following the verdict, neighbors, activists, and strangers alike came together to mourn the loss of a little girl who had been failed by those meant to protect her. A candlelight vigil was held in JAILYN's memory outside the home where she had lived. Dozens gathered, their faces illuminated by flickering candles, as they placed flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes along the steps of the house. The air was filled with quiet sobs and whispers of prayers as people remembered a child they may have only known from passing glances but who now symbolized something much larger. She deserved so much more than this, one attendee murmured, clutching a teddy bear meant for JAILYN's memorial. Speakers at the vigil included neighbors, child welfare advocates, and clergy members. They shared messages of hope, resilience, and the pressing need for systemic change. This tragedy didn't happen in isolation, said one advocate. It's a result of cracks in a system that should have caught the signs earlier. We need to do better, not just for JAILYN but for every child like her. The case sparked a larger conversation about the ways society can better support struggling parents and safeguard vulnerable children. Calls for stricter monitoring of at-risk families grew louder, with advocates urging local and state governments to allocate more resources to child welfare programs. At the same time, mental health organizations highlighted the importance of making mental health care more accessible for parents like Crystal, whose untreated struggles had tragic consequences. The tragedy also underscored the vital role of community vigilance. Many questioned how signs of neglect, JAILYN's cries, Crystal's absences, had gone unaddressed until it was too late. It's easy to feel like it's not our place to intervene, said one neighbor, wiping tears from her face. But I'll never ignore something like that again. I just wish I had spoken up sooner. The lessons from JAILYN's story are stark but necessary. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers have a role to play in protecting children from harm. The actions, or inactions, of those around Crystal highlighted the importance of stepping in when something feels wrong. Sometimes, a phone call or a kind word can make all the difference.
As a court, I have to remember JAILYN, where you did not. Just as you didn't let JAILYN out of her confinement until she died, so too, you should spend the rest of your life in a cell without freedom. The only difference will be that prison will at least feed you and give you liquids that you denied her. Based on all these factors, and based on all the things I've looked at, and I'm marking this as State's Exhibit 1 for the court order. On count 1, aggravated murder, I'm going to sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole.